You can see there's going to be another person involved. As many of you may know, from September through November, on Monday evenings, a group met consistently online, and we discussed our way through a book by the title of Good Disagreement, Grace and Truth in a Divided Church. And it was about what it sounds like it was about. Interestingly enough, even though the educational institution where I was introduced to this book is a Protestant non-denominational theological college, the authorship is entirely Anglican. It seems to be that in global Christianity, while we are a relatively small force these days, somewhat on the margins in a lot of ways, when other denominations find themselves winding up in the weeds and having conflicts that may result even in schism over major issues. In this day and age, human sexuality seems to be the real flashpoint, but of course in centuries past, there were others, such as whether the church can in any way participate in slavery, and other institutions that we now consider obviously completely out of line. And when such things come up, global Christianity seems to say, hey, you Anglicans, you have a bit of a history of being the broad middle way between factions that don't, on the surface, seem to have a whole lot in common. So this book was absolutely fascinating. It was a deep dive into how, in light of Scripture and in light of Christian tradition, we can disagree well, and where we really can manage to stay together even when those tensions and disagreements exist among us. The authors did not say that that is always possible. They did acknowledge there are certain times when there are principles that we believe are very much at the core. They are not what's called adiaphora, in other words, things of lesser importance, and we simply cannot remain in full communion if we have sharp disagreements around that. But within that context, there was a lot of amazing material. And so I have invited Tim Foote, who was one of it kind of fluctuated between about maybe 5 and 10 participants, but there was a regular core, and Tim was one of the most regular, and so he's going to answer a series of 4 questions on this topic. Thank you so much for being part of this conversation. So let's launch right in. The first question is, according to the text that we read and discussed, what is good disagreement, and how is it congruent with Christian scripture and tradition?
Well, thank you, Andy. So yes, it was a wonderful course, and if there's ever anyone of these courses in the future, I'd very much recommend them. For me personally, I took a lot from it, the fellowship of the group, just realizing how little I know about something so dear to me is actually quite astounding and quite worrying in some ways. But so you've asked me a really simple question here, Andy. What is good disagreement? Well, I think there's no simple answer, is the answer. So maybe it's best to start with what's bad disagreement. Well, on the bad disagreement side, it could be as simple as everything breaks down. It descends into insults. And in actual fact, we looked at some of the insults that Martin Luther had used, and actually they're quite fruity. So if you're interested, you could look that up. But worse still, it can actually descend into violence, total breakdown of any relationship. So, as Andy says, the Christian church has a long history of division over different items that at the time may have felt incredibly important. We discussed whether, on reflection in the modern day, some of those divisions might still be relevant, but it was very difficult to get to the answer. But one of the things that came across was the importance of the church, at least to the outside world, to the secular world, kind of trying its best to be together, to be united, and quite often we don't do a marvellous job on that. So as Andy said, there's this new term, adiaphora, which came up over and over again. It's kind of trying to discern what's important enough to make a stand and what's not. So we spoke about this kind of idea of a tolerant mind and a tolerant spirit. So a tolerant mind is kind of like, well, let's just agree to disagree on pretty much everything. And whilst that might sound like a great answer, sometimes it's not. Some things are so critical to the faith that actually you just have to make a stand. But regardless, the tolerant spirit part is to show love and appreciation that this is difficult and there's not a simple answer, but we should respect each other regardless of the differences that we've got. So we kind of thought, well, are there at least some common ground across all issues? And we kind of came back to, well, there's the two commandments, love God and your neighbour as yourselves, that really kind of, we thought, well, at least we can agree on that, hopefully, but if not, we're in trouble. So that's probably where I'll stop for now. We'll keep going on.
Well, thank you, and you already began to touch on this, but the second question is, what are some examples of how good disagreement can play out in the global church?
Well, again, it's quite easy to look at, some of the bad disagreement where the church actually just splits almost irrevocably, and much to the joy of some who like to knock the Christian faith. So, some of the really headline issues, the role of women in the church, as you mentioned, sexuality, marriage, even things like infant baptism, and as us Anglicans, we get very excited about the liturgy. Even things like inserting the peace into the liturgy can be controversial. So, when we looked at the role that Justin Welby has, to try and keep the family together, particularly around things such as the role of women in the church, I don't envy him on that at all. But we kind of came to the conclusion that, or at least we thought, keeping the dialogue going through all of this is probably the main thing. So treat the church as a family, and within families, I know myself, there's a lot of disagreement, but ultimately at the end of the day, we all love each other and we care about each other, so therefore trying to keep dialogue going is probably the way to get to good disagreement.
Well, thank you, and just in case we hadn't made this personal enough, what are some examples of how good disagreement can play out locally here in our congregation and our community?
Yeah, so I'm an outsider. You might have worked that out from my accent, but I'm not from around here. But I've noticed that politics is very divided at this point, and I'm not going to put any opinion on that. I'm just saying that's what I see as a fact. I noticed that there was the diocese at the time of we were doing this course. There was an agenda put out from the diocese, and it kind of struck me as kind of political. And I wondered how that might play out in a congregation which is presumably quite mixed in terms of its views. So that was one area that could have been thorny, so we kind of touched on that a little bit. When we think of this building, there's various uses of this building by different groups. So we spoke about the ecumenical work and the idea of reaching out to other denominations. Can we find common ground? And I noticed that there was some outreach, I think, to the local Muslim community recently, and some other ongoing work like that. So in the local area, even in here, in this building today, there'll be different views on different things, and the beauty of the Anglican Church is actually we are quite diverse, and we don't have one common statement of belief as such that everyone has to sign up to. It's kind of fairly open, so hopefully as an Anglican Church we can live that out and have good disagreement.
Thank you. And finally, you have definitely already touched on this, but what are some wonderings and not yet settled questions that this conversation has left you with?
A lot. A lot of questions that I didn't even know I had before we started. One of them was around about the importance of scripture. So, kind of in my naivety, I kind of think that, well, the answer must be in the Bible, and we just go and search up page 268 and it will tell me what the answer is. Well, it transpires it's not that simple. So, scripture is incredibly important, but there's also reason. I think it's C.S. Lewis who says that, I'm going to butcher this, but God wouldn't have given us the brain to be able to think about things if He didn't want us to use it. So we shouldn't just be passively looking for an answer. We've got to kind of discern it too. And so that was something that really struck me. Like, wow, I've not really thought about that. So that was one thing I'd like to explore a bit further. Why does that have to be so confusing? The answer's not straightforward. It's grey. It's not easy. So that was one thing. And then so I spoke about the ecumenical side of things. That really kind of fascinated me too. That even in a city like Livermore, which is not huge, there's a whole range of different churches that are all Christian denominations. You just think, how much common ground can we get to, and why do we have to all be in separate buildings necessarily? Maybe if we looked at some things afresh, maybe things might be different. But so in answer to your question, Andy, it's really opened up an appetite to learn more for me, and massive fan of it. I tuned in from Boise, Idaho, I think, and Claire was sat there thinking, what's going on from a hotel room? Also from New York, and I did draw a line at England. It was 3 in the morning, and I was like, I'm not going to do this. But so anyway, lots more questions to come.
Well, thank you, Tim. Let's give him some thanks. That was obviously just a teaser, to put it mildly. Things that took 30 seconds there took an entire class session, and even so, as you could tell, they were hardly resolved in a nice neatly wrapped package with a bow. This is a challenging and ongoing conversation. We wouldn't have been having it if it were otherwise. In the spring, we're going to move into the topic of prayer, which might seem to be not that related, but I would actually maintain it's incredibly related. We can't even begin to talk and think about good disagreement unless our personal, our mystical connection with God and with one another through God is strong. Prayer, of course, is the primary language that we have for that. So it's very much connected. The last thing I want to say is there's also a deep connection to a past class. Some of you may remember that one of the most recent previous courses we had was talking about the Lambeth Conference and the Anglican Communion in general. It's very significant that we call the global church that we're part of the Anglican Communion, not the Anglican Confession. Here's why, and here's why it actually is, for all of its flaws, a pretty good model of good disagreement. What it means is, if you were to go to an Anglican church in a place like Uganda or Nigeria, you would walk right in and find, even though you wouldn't maybe understand a word of the language being spoken, the liturgy follows a pattern that you're incredibly familiar with. You'd know exactly where you are, and nobody would bat an eye at you coming to the communion table and receiving the body and blood of Christ, and vice versa. That's what it means for us to have a communion. But if you translated the sermon and much of the messaging coming out of those particular parishes and dioceses, it would sound radically different from what you're familiar with here in the Episcopal Diocese of California. On a confessional level, there are huge disagreements and tensions. And Tim talked about Justin Welby. He's the current Archbishop of Canterbury. His job is really to be the icon, if you will, of the unity of that communion. and a body that somehow holds together in the faith that what we share around this communion table bonds us together more strongly than all the disagreements that are trying to pull us apart. And that's really a profound act of faith. But that's what the Anglican Communion is all about, and Tim alluded to that a bit. So all of this work and conversation we've been doing is interconnected, and I hope as the new year dawns, you will take part in it.